In the pre-dawn darkness of a New Mexico desert on the 22nd of September 1945, a young German sergeant named Georg Gartner made a decision that would define the next 4 decades of his life. At just 24 years old, this veteran of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps had spent weeks observing the patterns of freight trains that rumbled past Camp Deming. He had memorized their schedules, studied the guards' routines, and waited for the right moment. That night finally came. As he dropped to his belly and crawled beneath the first of 2 fence lines, Gartner wasn't simply attempting another prison break. He was making a calculated choice between 2 impossible futures, and he chose the one that offered hope rather than certainty of suffering. The young sergeant's hometown of Schweidnitz in Lower Silesia had effectively vanished from the map of Germany. Under the Potsdam Agreement, the territory had been transferred to Polish control. For Gartner, returning home meant subjecting himself to Soviet occupation, where he faced potential execution, or, if he were fortunate enough to survive, deportation to the brutal labor camps of Siberia. As his hands and knees scraped against the desert sand and he pushed toward the railroad tracks, he understood that he wasn't merely escaping confinement. He was abandoning a homeland that no longer existed in favor of a nation that had been his enemy just months before. The calculation Gartner made that night wasn't unique to him alone. Spread across the continental United States, from the rocky coast of Maine to the beaches of California, 511 prisoner of war camps held a staggering total of 371,683 German soldiers and officers. Every single one of them faced the same impossible mathematics that Gartner had worked through in his mind. According to meticulous U.S. Army documentation, there would be 2,222 recorded attempts to escape from these camps. When the final ships departed American shores and the last repatriation was completed, military records would show that 7 prisoners could never be accounted for. Beyond these dramatic escapes, thousands more German prisoners would resist through different means: legal petitions, deliberately slowed work performance, and strategic delays in processing. The resistance grew so determined and widespread that by 1946, the American military found itself in the extraordinary position of using armed soldiers to force the final groups of unwilling prisoners onto vessels bound for a devastated Europe. The desperation that drove these men wasn't written in battle plans or military doctrine. It existed in individual human choices made under unthinkable pressure. Each prisoner weighed impossible options: the near certainty of Soviet persecution against continued American imprisonment, the known starvation ravaging Germany against the uncertain future of living illegally in the United States, the documented reality of death in communist-controlled territories against the dangerous gamble of becoming permanent fugitives in the land of their former enemies. Everything changed on the 7th of May, 1945, when Germany signed unconditional surrender documents. For the massive population of 371,683 German prisoners held in American custody, the war had officially ended. Yet for approximately 123,000 of these men whose family homes now lay behind Soviet lines or in territories that had been transferred to Polish control, their personal nightmare was only beginning. The Geneva Convention's 75th article contained clear, unambiguous language mandating the rapid return of prisoners of war once hostilities had ceased. However, documents that would later be declassified revealed that the U.S. State Department faced an unprecedented crisis. These prisoners came from territories that no longer answered to German authority. The ancient Prussian lands in the east had become Russian territory. The regions of Silesia and Pomerania were now governed by Poland. The Sudetenland belonged to Czechoslovakia. These men quite literally had no Germany to which they could return. By the time July of 1945 arrived, camp commanders stationed throughout America began reporting a disturbing pattern. Military psychiatrists who examined prisoners scheduled for repatriation documented severe anxiety disorders spreading through the camps. The psychological crisis was real and measurable. The situation grew so desperate and violent that the US military would ultimately carry out 14 executions of German prisoners who had murdered fellow captives suspected of cooperating with American authorities or accepting repatriation. Dozens of additional deaths officially recorded as suicides were almost certainly murders committed by prisoners who believed their victims were betraying the collective resistance to being shipped back to Europe. The most sophisticated and organized resistance to repatriation would emerge at Fort Eustis in Virginia, where the US Army's controversial attempt to screen prisoners for Nazi sympathies triggered what would become the largest coordinated opposition to repatriation in the entire history of American military operations. On January 6, 1946, Fort Eustis became ground zero for systematic resistance. According to official military documentation, Fort Eustis processed 22,000 German prisoners through a highly controversial 6-day democracy education course that would ultimately determine each man's fate and timeline for return. The screening system implemented at Fort Eustis divided the prisoner population into 3 distinct categories, each with dramatically different consequences. Those classified as white were determined to be anti-Nazi in their beliefs and sympathies. Those designated as grey were considered politically neutral, having no strong ideological commitments either way. The prisoners classified as black were identified as committed Nazis who remained ideologically loyal to the defeated regime. The consequences of these classifications were severe. Those marked as black faced an additional 2 to 3 years of forced labour in either Britain or France before they would be permitted to return to Germany. Those fortunate enough to receive the white classification could return directly to German territory without additional detention. This classification system immediately created opportunities for resistance and manipulation. Prisoners quickly discovered they could trade their classifications like currency. A prisoner with a white classification could sell his identity and papers to a black classified officer in exchange for cigarettes, chocolate, or other valuable commodities within the camp economy. The elaborate scheme worked for a time until the age discrepancies and rank mismatches became too obvious to overlook during final processing reviews. Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, who had previously operated similar programs at Fort Getty in Rhode Island, ultimately received the Legion of Merit for his work in these re-education efforts. Yet even Smith, who believed deeply in the program's goals, acknowledged the fundamental contradictions built into the system. The program asked prisoners to attend lectures about democratic principles and freedom, while simultaneously keeping them imprisoned indefinitely without charge or trial. This irony was not lost on the German prisoners themselves, who could clearly see the gap between American rhetoric and their lived reality. By February of 1946, the resistance at Fort Eustis had evolved beyond individual acts into coordinated passive resistance. Prisoners systematically destroyed their identification documents, then claimed they couldn't possibly be repatriated without proper papers to verify their identities. Mass reports of illness overwhelmed the medical infrastructure. The camp hospital, which had been designed and staffed to handle routine medical care, suddenly found itself operating at 10 times its normal capacity as prisoners exhibited a wide range of symptoms that supposedly prevented them from travelling. The medical staff knew most of the claims were fabricated, but they lacked the resources to properly evaluate each case. To truly understand the level of desperation that drove this resistance, one must examine the most elaborate and ambitious escape attempt in the entire history of prisoner of war camps in America. This became known as the Great Papago Escape, and it occurred on Christmas Eve of 1944. Camp Papago Park, located in Arizona, housed approximately 3,100 German prisoners, with the population consisting primarily of captured naval personnel. Among these prisoners was Kapitän zur See Jürgen Wattenberg, who had commanded the submarine U-162 before his capture. The escape plan that Wattenberg and his fellow officers developed required 3 full months of careful execution. 25 prisoners worked in shifts to dig a tunnel that ultimately stretched 178 feet from a bathhouse all the way to beyond the camp's perimeter fence. The excavation produced approximately 30 tons of dirt that needed to be concealed from the guards. The prisoners came up with an ingenious solution. They told the guards they wanted to construct a volleyball court and needed to level the ground properly. The guards saw nothing suspicious about this request and approved it, never realizing that the unnecessary volleyball court was built solely to hide the excavated tunnel dirt. On Christmas Eve, while the American guards attended holiday celebrations and the majority of prisoners staged a loud, diversionary party complete with singing and entertainment, 25 officers slipped away and escaped through the completed tunnel. Their intended destination revealed their true intentions and fears. They weren't trying to somehow return to Germany across an ocean and a continent. They were heading south to Mexico, where they hoped the neutral government might provide sanctuary and protection from repatriation. The aftermath of the Great Papago escape demonstrated the practical futility of escape attempts in America's vast landscape. Wattenberg, the mastermind behind the tunnel, was finally recaptured on January 28, 1945, after a Phoenix resident reported seeing a suspicious man asking for directions to Mexico in heavily accented English. 3 U-boat officers who had escaped with him were discovered after just 3 days, sitting in a Phoenix public park after the men had made the disturbing discovery that Arizona's rivers, so prominently marked on their stolen maps, existed mostly as dry beds rather than flowing water sources. The punishment for their dramatic escape attempt? They received sentences of bread and water for a number of days equal to the time they had spent at large. Of all the 2,222 escape attempts documented by military records, only Georg Gartner succeeded completely and permanently. After his September 22, 1945 escape from Camp Deming, he managed to catch a freight train heading west to California. For the next 40 years of his life, he lived under the assumed identity of Dennis F. Wiles, a name he had chosen after traveling with a migrant farm family originally from Arkansas. Gartner worked a remarkable variety of jobs during his decades as a fugitive. Dishwasher in various restaurants, lumberjack in the northern forests, ski instructor at the Sugar Bowl Resort near Lake Tahoe, and tennis professional at various clubs. He successfully obtained a Social Security card under his false name, married a woman named Jean Clark in 1964, and together they adopted 2 children. He eventually established himself as a construction estimator and architectural consultant, designing and building custom homes throughout Southern California. The FBI maintained Gartner on their wanted list for the entire 40 years, distributing his photograph and description to 10,000 post offices across the nation. J. Edgar Hoover personally signed the arrest warrant with Gartner's name on it. Yet despite being actively wanted by federal law enforcement, Gartner lived openly and even occasionally publicly. In January of 1952, he volunteered to join a ski expedition organized to rescue passengers stranded on the City of San Francisco train, which had become trapped in a Sierra Nevada blizzard. Life magazine, one of the most widely circulated publications in America, photographed the entire rescue team, including a clear image of Georg Gartner, while at the same time FBI wanted posters bearing his photograph hung in post offices in nearby towns. In 1984, after years of marriage, Gartner's wife threatened to leave him over his persistent refusal to discuss his past or explain certain inconsistencies in his background. Faced with losing his family, Gartner finally confessed the truth about his identity. The following year, he contacted historian Arnold Kramer and collaborated on a book titled Hitler's Last Soldier in America. Then, on September 11, 1985, Gartner made the extraordinary decision to surrender himself publicly on NBC's Today Show, appearing live with host Bryant Gumbel. The government's response to Gartner's surrender revealed a bizarre legal impossibility that lawyers struggled to untangle. Gartner couldn't be prosecuted for the act of escape because escape from a prisoner of war camp wasn't classified as a federal crime. He couldn't be deported because he had been brought to America against his will as a captured prisoner rather than arriving as an immigrant. He couldn't be charged with illegal entry because he had never technically entered the country through normal channels. The FBI announced it had no further interest in pursuing the case. The Immigration and Naturalization Service confirmed they had no interest in deportation proceedings. In November of 2009, at the age of 88, Georg Gartner finally achieved what he had secretly wanted for more than 6 decades. He became an American citizen in a ceremony held in Denver. He died peacefully in Loveland, Colorado in 2013, having lived 68 years in the country from which he was supposed to have been expelled in 1945. While prisoners desperately resisted repatriation through escapes and resistance, American farmers and agricultural businesses fought their own battle to keep these same prisoners in the country. The economic statistics told a compelling story that was difficult for politicians to ignore. During 1945 alone, German prisoner labour had harvested 900 million pounds of vegetables across American farms, picked 168 million pounds of fruit, and generated an estimated $230 million in agricultural value, all at the remarkably low wage of 80 cents per day paid not to the prisoners themselves, but to the US government. Congressional records from February of 1945 show politicians from rural agricultural states formally requesting the retention of 100,000 additional prisoner laborers to address critical farm labor shortages. The Great Western Sugar Company took the extraordinary step of formally petitioning Congress to retain 3,121 specific German prisoners indefinitely to work in their facilities. In Idaho, the J.R. Simplot Company, which would decades later become famous for supplying McDonald's with French fries, employed approximately 2,000 German prisoners in dehydrated potato factories that produced food supplies for American forces still fighting in the Pacific Theater. This push to retain prisoner labor faced fierce opposition from organized labor unions. The Congress of Industrial Organizations and the American Federation of Labor published advertisements showing returning American soldiers unable to find employment, while German prisoners of war continued laboring in American fields and factories. Union leaders characterized the situation as a betrayal of veterans, arguing it was unconscionable to employ former enemies while American soldiers returned home to unemployment. The conflict between agricultural necessity and organized labor interests created unusual political alliances that cut across traditional party lines. Southern senators found themselves aligned with Midwestern farmers against the positions of Northern industrial unions. The Farm Bureau Federation clashed repeatedly with the War Manpower Commission over requirements for union participation in worker recruitment programs, while farmers insisted they desperately needed labor, regardless of its source. Military regulations in place at the time strictly prohibited fraternization between American personnel and prisoners of war, with violations potentially resulting in court-martial for service members. Despite these strict prohibitions and severe penalties, relationships inevitably developed. The most extensively documented case involved Second Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African-American Army nurse, and a German Wehrmacht medic named Frederick Albert. They met while both were stationed at Camp Florence in Arizona during 1944. Powell was one of only 63 black nurses serving in the entire Army Nurse Corps at that time. She had been assigned to prisoner of war wards specifically because military leadership believed that racial prejudice among the German prisoners would prevent any possibility of fraternization. When Albert received his repatriation orders in March of 1946, Powell discovered she was pregnant with his child. Albert made the strategic legal decision to use his American-born child as grounds for immigration, successfully applying for permission to return to the United States. He came back in 1946, and on June 26, 1947, they married in Manhattan, one of only 16 states in the nation that permitted interracial marriage at that time. Research published by Barbara Schmitter-Heisler in her 2013 work, From German prisoner of war to American citizen, documents that approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually emigrated to America through various legal channels, with an estimated 1,200 of them marrying American women. The military's deliberate suppression and destruction of records relating to fraternization makes determining precise numbers impossible. The terror-driving prisoner resistance had a documented and specific cause that prisoners witnessed firsthand. Operation Keelhaul, conducted between August 14, 1946 and May 9, 1947, forcibly returned 2.75 million Soviet nationals from zones controlled by Western allies back to Soviet territory. American intelligence agencies later estimated that approximately 50% of those forcibly repatriated were either immediately executed or sent to Siberian labor camps where most would die. The McNerney-Clark Directive, signed by senior American commanders, contained explicit language stating that individuals could be repatriated without any regard to their personal wishes and by force if deemed necessary. This directive remained classified until 1975, and its eventual publication proved that forced repatriation policies weren't limited only to Soviet citizens. German prisoners from Eastern territories witnessed these forced repatriations of Soviet citizens with their own eyes. At Camp Shanks in New York, they watched through the camp fences as Soviet prisoners were physically dragged to waiting trains. Some Soviet prisoners chose suicide rather than face what awaited them upon return. These scenes, witnessed by thousands of German prisoners, convinced those from Soviet-occupied territories that escape or determined resistance offered their only realistic chance for survival. The Supreme Court case Johnson v. Eisentrager, decided in 1950, legally established that German nationals held by American military forces had no access to United States courts for habeas corpus petitions challenging their detention. This ruling retroactively validated the military's long-standing position that prisoners of war possessed no legal recourse to challenge repatriation orders through the American judicial system. Congressional records reveal extensive debate about the possibility of retaining prisoner labor beyond the war's end. In February of 1945, representatives from agricultural states formally requested permission to retain 100,000 German prisoners. However, these requests focused specifically on extending detention for labor purposes, rather than offering any path toward permanent residency rights or citizenship. The State Department's strategic reclassification of German prisoners from prisoners of war to surrendered enemy personnel or disarmed enemy forces in June of 1945 effectively removed Geneva Convention protections from these men. This legal maneuver allowed for extended detention and continued labor exploitation while avoiding the full protections that the Geneva Convention mandated for prisoners of war. The War Department issued Emergency Directive 411 on January 15, 1946, requiring all camps to implement suicide prevention protocols. These protocols included mandatory confiscation of belts, razors, rope, and any other items that could be used for self-harm. Agricultural communities across the United States documented their advocacy for retaining German prisoner labor through letters, petitions, and public demonstrations. Wisconsin's Door County publicly credited 2,140 German prisoners with single-handedly saving their entire 1945 cherry crop by picking 508,020 pails of cherries. In Texas, where estimates suggested 300,000 agricultural workers were needed to maintain production, farmers grew so economically dependent on prisoner labor that they organized protests when camps began closing. The Spokesman Review newspaper reported multiple cases of entire communities physically blocking roads when military police convoys arrived to collect prisoners for repatriation processing. On March 15, 1946, at Pier 51 on Staten Island, the Liberty ship General Sturgis waited at dock to transport 1,500 German prisoners across the Atlantic to Bremerhaven. When buses arrived from Fort Dix carrying the scheduled prisoners, longshoremen discovered desperate men who had to be physically dragged aboard the vessel. The International Longshoremen's Association threatened work stoppages rather than participate in loading what they characterized as unwilling human cargo onto ships. Camp Shanks in New York served as the primary deportation processing facility. Originally built to process 1,000 prisoners weekly, by April of 1946 it was handling 5,000 prisoners each week. On April 22, 1946, 30 prisoners scheduled for imminent departure soared through the floors of their barracks and attempted to escape through underground sewage pipes. 27 were recaptured almost immediately. The final 3 managed to reach the Hudson River before Coast Guard patrol boats pulled them from the water and returned them to custody. Navy records document at least 17 confirmed suicides during Atlantic crossings between March and July of 1946, though the actual number was likely higher since deaths classified as accidents or men listed as missing at sea may have included additional suicides. The Germany awaiting these returning prisoners offered conditions that made continued imprisonment in America seem preferable. Official rations in the British occupation zone provided only 1,040 calories daily, well below the subsistence level required to maintain health. The winter of 1946–47 saw rations drop even further. Infant mortality rates doubled compared to pre-war levels. Former President Herbert Hoover, who conducted an inspection tour of occupied Germany, reported a 40% increase in mortality among Germans over 70 years of age during the fall of 1946. Approximately 20% of German housing stock had been destroyed by bombing and artillery. The forced expulsion of 12 million ethnic Germans from Eastern territories created an unprecedented refugee crisis that overwhelmed the available resources. Industrial output in 1947 reached only 1/3 of 1938 levels. Food production hit just 51% of pre-war per capita levels. For prisoners of war who originated from Soviet-occupied zones, return carried the very real possibility of immediate execution or forced labor in Soviet camps. The Red Army's occupation had resulted in an estimated 2 million rapes of German women. Soviet authorities were systematically dismantling entire factories and shipping the machinery east as war reparations. Any German male between the ages of 16 and 60 faced possible deportation to Soviet labor camps without trial or formal charges. Congressional records from 1945 through 1947 reveal intense continuing pressure from agricultural states to extend prisoner labor retention. In response to public complaints about prisoner treatment, the Office of Provost Marshal General ordered reductions in prisoner food rations and ended canteen sales in May of 1945. This deliberate worsening of conditions triggered immediate work stoppages among prisoners who correctly observed that their treatment was deteriorating despite Germany's unconditional surrender. Military officials justified the extended detention by arguing that Germany's complete lack of functioning government meant that a formal state of peace had never been officially concluded, which they claimed allowed continued detention under Geneva Convention Article 75. The creation of new legal classifications, including surrendered enemy personnel and disarmed enemy forces, enabled continued labor exploitation while technically avoiding the full protections that the Geneva Convention mandated for traditional prisoners of war. President Truman ultimately ordered the completion of repatriation despite intense pressure from agricultural interests, though significant delays specifically for harvest labor needs extended well into 1948. The final German prisoners weren't actually returned from American territory until the summer of 1946, and many of those men spent additional years performing forced labor in Britain and France before finally being permitted to return to German territory. The complete statistical record tells the full story of this crisis. 371,683 German prisoners were held in American custody. 2,222 documented escape attempts occurred. 7 prisoners were never accounted for in final tallies. 14,000 repatriations were deliberately delayed specifically for agricultural necessity. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually returned to America as legal immigrants. 580,000 Germans immigrated to America during the 1950s. 210,000 Germans immigrated during the 1960s. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 admitted 415,000 displaced persons by 1952, including approximately 60,000 Germans. Many former prisoners were certainly among these immigration numbers, though precise tracking remains impossible due to deliberate record destruction and the limitations of immigration documentation from that era. The economic impact of prisoner labour was undeniable and extensively documented. 14 million man-days of agricultural labour were performed. 100 million board feet of lumber were processed. $230 million in labour value was generated, calculated in 1940s dollars. The wage of 80 cents per day per prisoner was paid directly to the US government rather than to the prisoners themselves. German prisoners performed work in 46 states, filling critical labour shortages that would have crippled agricultural production. They built infrastructure, harvested crops, and maintained industries that would have collapsed without their labour contributions. Communities that relied heavily on prisoner labour often became their strongest advocates for retention policies. The Special Projects Division represented the US military's secret re-education program, which ultimately reached 40,000 German prisoners. The program published a prisoner newspaper called Der Ruf, meaning the call, and distributed books that had been banned in Nazi Germany. Following VE Day, 25,000 prisoners graduated from formal democracy courses, and these graduates were permitted to return directly to Germany instead of facing additional years of forced labour in European countries. 135 camp newspapers were published across the various camps throughout America, reflecting the gradually changing attitudes among the prisoner population. By 1945, 8 of the 20 camp newspapers still being published continued to advocate Nazi ideology. However, the clear majority had shifted their editorial focus toward discussions of democracy, reconstruction, and Germany's future. Notable graduates of these re-education programs included Walter Hallstein, who later became president of the European Commission, Hans Kroll, who served as West German ambassador to the United States, and Rüdiger von Wechmar, who became Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided the first significant legal pathway for former prisoners of war to return to America. Between 1948 and 1952, approximately 5,000 former German prisoners successfully immigrated under various provisions of the Act and related programs. Requirements included securing American sponsors, providing proof of non-Nazi party membership, and demonstrating means of financial support. Barbara Schmitter-Heisler's research, based on 35 extensive interviews with former prisoners, documents their successful integration into American society. Many became successful business owners, engineers, and respected community leaders. Their children and grandchildren now constitute a significant and often unrecognized portion of German-American families throughout the United States. After finally leaving American shores, many German prisoners faced additional years of forced labor in other Allied nations. Britain received 175,000 German prisoners who were required to work until 1948, with 25,000 ultimately choosing to remain in Britain as civilian workers. France received 740,000 German prisoners and kept many of them until 1949 for reconstruction work. These extensions clearly violated Geneva Convention requirements for rapid repatriation following the cessation of hostilities, but were justified by Allied governments as legitimate war reparations. The very last German prisoners weren't released from Allied custody anywhere until 1949, a full 4 years after the war's official end. Published memoirs provide documented first-hand evidence of prisoner experiences in American camps. Lewis Carlson's 1997 work, We Were Each Other's Prisoners, based on more than 150 extensive interviews, documents widespread desire among German prisoners to somehow remain in America rather than return to devastated Germany. At a 1985 reunion held in Austin, Texas, more than 500 former prisoners returned to America to reunite with guards, farmers, and host families. Their testimonies, carefully preserved in various archives, consistently describe treatment as prisoners that was significantly better than what they experienced as civilians in post-war Germany. Arnold Kramer, who spent decades interviewing former prisoners for his research, noted that 95% of former prisoners rated their treatment in American camps as either good or excellent. Perhaps most remarkably, thousands of former prisoners maintained regular correspondence with American families for decades after their forced repatriation, building friendships that transcended the war. The transformation of German prisoners from enemies to potential citizens appeared repeatedly in multiple government reports from various agencies. The State Department acknowledged that prisoners exposed to American democracy and prosperity inadvertently became ambassadors for American values upon their return to Germany. Military intelligence reported that prisoners who worked on American farms frequently developed stronger loyalty to their host communities than to defeated Germany. These observations significantly influenced later American policies toward enemy combatants and displaced persons from other conflicts. While precise numbers remain elusive due to military suppression of records and deliberate document destruction, documented evidence confirms that hundreds of romantic relationships developed between prisoners and American women. The Immigration and Naturalization Service received more than 3,000 inquiries from American women seeking to sponsor former prisoners between 1946 and 1950. The vast majority of these applications were rejected based on regulations that specifically excluded former enemy combatants from standard immigration quotas. However, approximately 1,200 former prisoners eventually did marry American women, either returning through legal immigration channels or meeting their future wives during later tourist visits to America. Of the 2,222 escape attempts from a population of 371,683 prisoners, the success rate of just 0.6% represents remarkably low numbers compared to prisoner escape rates in other nations during the war. The vast majority of escapees were recaptured within 24 hours of their escape attempts. The immense distances involved, significant language barriers, and complete lack of underground support networks made successful permanent escape nearly impossible for most prisoners. 7 prisoners remained completely unaccounted for when final repatriation was concluded. Besides Georg Gartner, at least one other successful long-term fugitive has been documented. Kurt Rossmeisel lived under the assumed identity of Frank Ellis in Chicago for 14 years before finally surrendering in 1959. The other 5 unaccounted prisoners presumably either died during their escape attempts or successfully integrated into American society under permanently false identities, taking their secrets to their graves. Communities that fought hardest to retain German prisoners often prospered economically from their contributions and the relationships built during the war years. The J.R. Simplot Company, built partly on the foundation of prisoner labor during the war, eventually became a billion-dollar agricultural enterprise. Agricultural techniques introduced by German prisoners, particularly advances in irrigation systems and sugar beet cultivation methods, permanently transformed American farming practices in several regions. Many former prisoners who eventually returned to America as legal immigrants became notably successful entrepreneurs. Their experience with American business practices during their captivity provided significant advantages when they later entered American commerce. Several founded companies that became major employers in their adopted communities, contributing substantially to local economic development. The resistance of German prisoners to repatriation significantly influenced American Cold War policy development. Their documented fear of Soviet occupation validated American governmental concerns about communist expansion throughout Europe. Their personal stories of forced repatriation became valuable propaganda tools for demonstrating communist brutality to both domestic and international audiences. The principle that people fleeing communist oppression deserved special consideration and protection, which was firmly established during the prisoner repatriation crisis, became deeply embedded in American immigration policy and remains influential today. This important precedent directly influenced the treatment of Hungarian refugees fleeing the failed uprising in 1956, Cuban refugees arriving after 1959 following Castro's revolution, and Vietnamese refugees who fled after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Of the 511 prisoner camps that existed across America, very few physical remains still exist today. Most were either converted to other uses or completely demolished in the decades following the war. However, their lasting impact on local communities persists through museums, historical markers, and annual commemorative events. Arnold Kramer's assessment that America won the propaganda war through sheer demonstrated reality rather than rhetoric reflects the scholarly consensus among historians. The program succeeded precisely because it demonstrated American values rather than merely preaching about them. Prisoners witnessed American prosperity firsthand, experienced democratic processes in daily life, and received humane treatment that contrasted sharply with their expectations. Their transformation from Nazi soldiers to democratic converts occurred primarily through direct observation and experience rather than heavy-handed indoctrination attempts. The last organized mass repatriation occurred during the summer of 1946, though individual cases and special circumstances extended for years longer. Military records clearly show that 14,000 prisoners had their repatriation deliberately delayed specifically for agricultural work purposes, which technically violated Geneva Convention requirements for rapid repatriation. Ships carrying reluctant prisoners back across the Atlantic to Europe reported widespread despair among the human cargo. Captain Harold Morrison of the Marine Phoenix documented disturbing incidents including hunger strikes, multiple suicide attempts, and episodes of mass hysteria among prisoners who had convinced themselves that the ships were actually sailing to Soviet-controlled ports rather than to western zones of Germany. Former prisoners who successfully returned to America as legal immigrants played significant and often unrecognized roles in Germany's post-war reconstruction and in building German-American relations. They brought valuable knowledge of American agricultural methods, business practices, and democratic ideals that proved influential in rebuilding German society. Their personal experience with American prosperity provided concrete models for economic recovery that influenced policy development. Walter Hallstein, who was educated at Fort Getty, helped design the European Economic Community. Hans Kroll, who was imprisoned at Camp Shelby, worked to foster stronger German-American diplomatic relations during his service as ambassador. Rüdiger von Wechmar, held at Camp Herne, promoted international cooperation during his tenure at the United Nations. The National Archives maintains extensive collections of records relating to German prisoner camps, though many significant documents remain classified even today and others were deliberately destroyed according to standard military protocols of that era. Surviving materials include camp newspapers, thousands of photographs, and detailed administrative records. Various universities and local historical societies across America maintain valuable oral history collections containing recorded interviews with both former prisoners and American personnel who worked in the camps. These testimonies, recorded before most participants died, provide irreplaceable insights into the daily life, relationships, and complex dynamics within the camps that official records cannot capture. The prisoner repatriation crisis established several important legal precedents that continue to influence international law. Johnson versus Eisentrager firmly confirmed military authority over enemy combatants held during wartime. The controversial reclassification of prisoners as disarmed enemy forces created legal categories that remain debated in international law today. These precedents significantly influenced the treatment of combatants captured in Korea, Vietnam, and all later conflicts. Fundamental questions raised about forced repatriation, prisoner rights, and proper interpretation of Geneva Convention provisions continue to affect military detention policies and spark legal debates. Academic research across multiple disciplines has documented lasting impacts on American communities that hosted prisoner camps during the war. Towns and rural areas that developed positive relationships with prisoners often experienced measurable economic benefits from return visits by former prisoners and from sister city relationships established with German communities. Sociological studies have found measurably reduced prejudice levels and increased international awareness in communities that had significant interaction with prisoners during the war years. These effects have persisted through multiple generations, continuing to influence local attitudes toward immigration issues and foreign relations. Military intelligence services documented the various resistance methods employed by prisoners determined to avoid or delay repatriation. These methods included systematic destruction of identification documents that were required for processing, feigned illnesses requiring hospitalization and preventing travel, organized work slowdowns and strikes that disrupted camp operations, elaborate trading schemes for swapping classification categories, deliberate failing of democracy screening tests, and mass non-cooperation at designated departure points. While these techniques were ultimately unsuccessful in preventing the eventual repatriation of most prisoners, they significantly delayed the entire process and required extensive military resources to overcome. The International Red Cross conducted investigations into conditions during forced repatriation operations, eventually expressing serious concern about potential Geneva Convention violations. Their official report from March of 1946 documented severe psychological trauma among prisoners facing forced return to Soviet-occupied territories. American military chaplains who served in the camps reported experiencing profound moral conflicts between their duty to follow military orders and their personal desire to protect prisoners from likely persecution. Their testimonies, carefully preserved in military archives, reveal deep ethical struggles within the repatriation system that troubled many participants. The German prisoners who actively resisted repatriation after World War II represented far more than simple individual desperation or fear. In a profound sense, they validated core American principles through their desperate desire to remain in the country. Their resistance emerged from entirely rational calculation rather than emotion. They had personally witnessed American prosperity, experienced democratic processes firsthand, and compared these favorable experiences to the documented devastation and persecution awaiting them in Germany. Of 371,683 German prisoners held in American custody, 2,222 attempted escape, 7 disappeared permanently and were never accounted for, and approximately 5,000 eventually returned legally as immigrants. These numbers together tell a complex story of transformation, from enemies on the battlefield to potential citizens, from imprisoned soldiers to community residents, from defeated warriors for a failed ideology to genuine converts to democratic values. Georg Gartner's remarkable 40-year odyssey as America's last fugitive prisoner of war powerfully symbolizes this broader transformation. His successful integration into American society, despite living under an assumed identity for 4 decades, demonstrated conclusively that former enemies could become productive, law-abiding citizens who contributed positively to their communities. His voluntary surrender in 1985 and subsequent citizenship ceremony in 2009 provided a sense of closure to a chapter that had begun with his capture in North Africa in 1943. The intense economic arguments for retaining prisoners, including $230 million in agricultural value and critically needed labor during severe wartime shortages, stood in direct conflict with organized labor's legitimate demands for employment opportunities for returning American veterans. This tension reflected much larger questions about fundamental American values, the balance between economic necessity and moral obligations, and the nation's international commitments. The documented romantic relationships between prisoners and Americans, ultimately resulting in approximately 1,200 marriages, directly challenged wartime prejudices and violated military regulations. These deeply personal connections transcended nationality and ideology, creating human bonds that survived decades of forced separation. Operation Keelhaul's brutal forced repatriation of Soviet citizens, which prisoners witnessed firsthand, cast a long and terrifying shadow over German prisoners from Eastern territories. Seeing these traumatic scenes convinced many that determined resistance offered their only realistic chance of survival. The McNarney-Clark Directive's explicit authorization to use force without any regard to personal wishes validated their deepest fears about what awaited them. Fort Eustis's controversial democracy screening program, which processed 22,000 prisoners through a classification system with dramatically different outcomes, created more resistance than cooperation among the prisoner population. The fundamental irony of teaching democratic principles while simultaneously denying personal freedom wasn't lost on either the prisoners being processed or the outside observers who questioned the program. The absolute devastation awaiting prisoners in Germany, including starvation-level rations of 1,040 calories, widespread destruction of cities, and harsh Soviet occupation, made continued American captivity seem genuinely preferable to freedom in their homeland. This grim reality drove the documented suicide attempts, desperate escapes, and organized resistance preserved in military records. Congressional debates during this period revealed fundamental conflicts between agricultural necessity and labor rights, between economic pragmatism and adherence to international law, between immediate practical needs and longer-term moral considerations. The deliberate delay of 14,000 repatriations, specifically for agricultural work, clearly demonstrated how economic interests could override Geneva Convention requirements when political pressure became strong enough. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 finally provided meaningful legal pathways for former prisoners to return to America as immigrants rather than captives. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners successfully navigated the immigration system, eventually becoming American citizens, business owners, and respected community leaders. Their successful integration into American society proved conclusively that transformation from enemy to ally was genuinely possible. The broader immigration wave included 580,000 German immigrants during the 1950s, and 210,000 during the 1960s, with many of these immigrants influenced either directly by prisoner experiences or through personal connections formed during the war years. These substantial population movements profoundly shaped German-American relations for multiple generations. Former prisoners who achieved positions of prominence and influence, including Walter Hallstein, Hans Kroll, and Rüdiger von Wechmar, demonstrated that former enemies could indeed become valuable allies and partners through sustained exposure to democratic values and institutions. Their substantial contributions to German reconstruction efforts and to international cooperation validated the American investment in their education and humane treatment. The deliberate preservation of camp histories through dedicated museums, annual reunion gatherings, and extensive archival collections maintains important connections between former enemies. Annual gatherings held in places like Algona, Iowa, and Hearne, Texas, now celebrate transformation and reconciliation rather than dwelling on past conflict. Historical assessment and scholarly consensus confirms that American treatment of German prisoners, despite the legitimate controversies surrounding forced repatriation, succeeded in its broader goal of converting former enemies into allies who supported democratic values. The program's strategic reliance on demonstration of American values, rather than heavy-handed indoctrination attempts, proved remarkably effective in changing minds and attitudes. The important legal precedents established during the complex repatriation crisis continue to influence military detention policies and international law. Ongoing questions about prisoner rights, the ethics of forced repatriation, and proper interpretation of Geneva Convention provisions remain highly relevant in contemporary conflicts around the world. The story of German prisoners who refused to leave America ultimately transcends the specifics of World War II and speaks to universal human desires for freedom, opportunity, and dignity. These men, originally brought to American shores as captured enemies, discovered within America precisely what they had been ordered to destroy: a society that offered genuine hope and opportunity despite their status as prisoners. Their desperate resistance to repatriation validated fundamental American principles not through deliberate propaganda, but through their authentic, desperate desire to remain. In choosing America over forced repatriation, they chose possibility and hope over certainty of suffering, chose unknown futures over devastating and dangerous pasts. They arrived in chains as enemies of the state. Many fought desperately through every means available to stay. Some ultimately succeeded in that fight. Their remarkable transformation from enemies to citizens stands as powerful testament to America's genuine capacity for redemption and renewal, for turning former adversaries into friends and allies. The prison camps that were designed and built specifically to contain them became, for thousands of men, unexpected doorways opening to entirely new lives. The nation they had fought against on battlefields became the home they refused to leave despite tremendous pressure and personal risk. This is their documented story, verified through extensive military records, congressional testimony, personal memoirs, and rigorous historical research. It demonstrates clearly that even in war's bitter aftermath and amid tremendous suffering, genuine transformation remains possible. Former enemies can become trusted allies, and prisoners can recognize true freedom even while living behind barbed wire fences. The German prisoners who refused to leave America weren't simply escaping from something terrible. They were escaping to something they recognized as valuable and worth the enormous risk. In that fundamental choice lies proof that America's promise genuinely transcends nationality, that democracy's appeal surpasses rigid ideology, and that human dignity can survive even war's worst devastation. Their legacy lives on in their descendants scattered across America, in the communities that protected and advocated for them, and in the legal and policy precedents they established. They proved that America's greatest victory wasn't achieved on battlefields, but in demonstrating moral authority, showing the genuine ability to transform enemies into citizens through the simple but powerful demonstration of witnessed freedom and opportunity.